Ashley mentioned, what I do is use games and simulations to improve public policy. Why and how we do that, I'll talk about that in the slide. I will not be going into details about how each one of those games were made. Sometimes these games take us 3 months to make, sometimes 18 months, sometimes 24 months. That's a longer process. We can talk about that in detail later. I'm from Fields of View. What we do is design games and simulations, like I said, to improve public policy. We've done this in the area of transport, poverty, disaster management, energy, gender, waste. Why do we need to do this? Essentially because policies are hard problems, right? All of us sitting in the room has a different perspective each time we look at the problem, and which means that every single one of us has a different worldview. So we need to look at the problem very differently. And what that means is, if we are designing a policy for today, the policy needs to be relevant to us today. We can't really have, for example, metros being built in our cities right now, in many Indian cities, when the metro was probably required 10 years ago in many of our cities, right? So we need relevant and rapid policies. At the same time, what we also need to think about, if we talk about climate change, for example, policies that are responsive. Our needs keep changing, so how do you make it responsive? Another funny thing with respect to living in this real world, not in our fantasy worlds of games that many of us inhabit most of the time, that all of us don't inhabit the same world. All of us look at the world very differently. All of us view the world very, very differently. The reason is we come from very different backgrounds. The example that I keep giving people is the street in which we have our office. You have people who earn as little as 100 rupees a day to people who earn as much as a few lakh rupees a month, right? That's just in terms of economic diversity, right? Add language into the mix, right? Even in this room, I'm sure all of us, if we put together, we have about 10 languages that we can speak, read, and write. That's language diversity. I'm not even talking about caste. I'm not even talking about religion, right? When you add all of that into the mix, the problem is much more harder to understand. Forget even address or solve. Even to understand this problem becomes harder, right? And that's why we use games. Because we use games fundamentally, like Ivan was talking about in the morning as well, as a way to collect data. It's easy to collect data through surveys, through questionnaires, through forms. But one of the hardest things to collect when it comes to policies is preferences and biases, right? The simplest example is, I think if we do a dipstick survey, if I ask all of you, how many of you think that it's important that we segregate and sort waste, all of us will raise our hands, right? Because that's what we want everybody else to know about us. It's not necessarily what we believe in. So then how do you collect that data? The other example for this is when we did a survey in Bangalore of how many people wanted to have a mall next to their house or in their neighborhood. Most of them said no. And the reason for that, saying no, is it increases traffic, it's noisy, it increases waste generation in the area. But on an average, every single person in that neighborhood went to a mall at least once a week. So we are happy going to a mall in somebody else's neighborhood. We don't want a mall in our own neighborhood. How do we collect this preference data? How do we collect this bias data? Because nobody's going to tell it to us directly, right? So you can collect this intangible data through games. They're a wonderful source to collect. A lot of quantitative data can be collected as well, right? The easiest example is, he was talking about it in the healthcare sector. You can do that in disaster management that we do often. Response times of first responders. How quickly do they respond? How quickly are they able to do triage, for example, right? You can collect lots of quantitative data as well. The other reason that we use games is, like I said, all of us, it's a very diverse set of people that I'm talking about when I talk about India, right? All of our needs are very different. So when you have policy recommendations, let's say you want to build, you have a new transport plan, you want to build a new flyover system in Hyderabad, for example, or you want to build a metro. Because unfortunately for us, it's either or, right? Most of the time, because you have a limited amount of resources. You have a limited amount of time, you have a limited amount of money. So you need to figure out which would work best for you, right? How do you test which would work better and for whom? Games are again a wonderful way to do that. Because when you put people in these game environments, in these game situations, like I said earlier, they might lie about their preferences and needs. But when you're in a game environment, you become competitive. You're responding to what your neighbor is doing. You're responding to what the objective of the game is. You're responding to the fact that you're competitive and you want to win. So then you will get a very different behavior than when somebody is under observation. So then you get a behavior that might be typical of how they would behave when they're driving on the street, which is cutting each other off, which is not following lane discipline, right? So you want that behavior to be represented when you are taking feedback about a new policy. Because if you have a sanitized environment and people are doing, you're testing them on whether they'll follow lane discipline, everybody will follow lane discipline. Simplest example, you want to get people to think about the problem of waste better. What do? Design a game where you get points. If we talked about points earlier, right, in the previous session, a lot about points and currency, right, not having them. So in the game, you have a game where people get points for segregating or sorting waste. But nobody gives us points in the real world to do that, right? So we'll do it in the game to win. All of us are clever. We'll only do it in the game to win. Outside of the game, we will not follow those rules, right? Because those rules don't exist. So therefore, it becomes important to create an environment where you can test these policies. Important to have that space where players can also do things that they will not be judged upon. That becomes the key. How do you not judge them for what they're doing in the game? So what I'll do is just talk about a few games as well. But one of the things is whenever I talk about public policy in games, everybody gets very excited. Everybody wants to use games everywhere. It's that silver bullet. So what we've had to do, since I've been using games for about 12 years now in the area of public policy, almost for every game that I've created, we've said no to 10 other games because it's not relevant. It's not useful in that context because games are expensive to make, time consuming to make, and we have the privilege of having people use them, right? So when you have that privilege of having people use them, we need to treat it with a lot of respect. It cannot be an experience where they just come play the game and then they forget about the game 2 months later. So when you don't want that to happen, the game has to be highly contextual. So all of these games that I'm going to show you, for every single game, we've said no to 10 other games to create the game because it's not the right context. Over the course of the next few examples, I'll also talk about what the right context is for games in terms of public policy. For us, a game is a tool. It's not the end. It's not why we create the game, just to get people to play. For us, a game is created because we want to collect data about a different policy. For us, a game is created because we want to test whether option 1 is better for waste or option 2 is better for waste. That's why a game is used. So it becomes a tool, right? So when it becomes a tool, one of the biggest challenges is, I think Ivan touched upon it in the morning, is validity. Everybody will ask you, you're using it a tool. Is it a valid tool, right? Because if you're going to use a scale to measure 6 centimeters, everybody will want to know if that scale is accurate and does it do 6 centimeters, right? Otherwise, they don't want to use the scale, right? You want to throw away the scale. You want to use a different scale that is more accurate. But the idea of using games is that it's not really about accuracy. When you talk about validity, it's also about what are the results being used, where are you using them, how are you using them, and getting that across and doing that is the hardest part of this work. Because the easier parts actually are the fact that the game is not a standalone object. When I meant it's a tool, that's also what I mean. You don't go and play the game and then walk away. It's part of a larger process. So some of these games I will show you that are going to be used in different contexts. They fit into somebody's everyday work activity. It doesn't mean that you increase their labor. You are actually reducing their work by using the game. So unless you do that, people will not want to use the game. So on that note, I'll continue with examples because otherwise I'll just be talking about this. Sorry, this is a game that we've created on urban planning. As you can see, this is a physical game. It's not a digital game. What people do is they build a city that they want to live in together. That's it. There's no complications. And what we use in the game, as you can see, we can use paper cups, we can use much more fancier things, we can use whatever we want. And this game is a physical game for a couple of reasons. One is entry barrier. As soon as we move to the digital world, there is a huge entry barrier for a lot of people who are not used to the digital interface, to the user experience in the digital world. So that reduces interaction. The second challenge with games like this, when you move to the digital world, is we are in the game developer conference. but I am going to say this. The digital world is probably the worst possible interface that you can use when you want people to collaborate, when you want people to interact with each other, when you want people to fight with each other, when you want people to discuss with each other. The digital interface is a very isolating experience. You are working only with your screen, and we've observed that in all of our games. Whether we're playtesting them, whether we're actually doing it with the live players, we've seen that. As soon as you put a screen in front of people, they don't want to interact with anybody else. It's me and the screen. The screen dictates how I interact with somebody else as well, right? So that's a tricky part. In this game, how I interact with the other person is very important because that's how I'm responding. Earlier, I told you about the mall question, right? That's actually a result from this game. Now, we've had over 200 runs of this game. We've had less than 5 cities that have been built which had police stations in them. If I'd asked all of you to build a game in this room as well, you wouldn't have built a police station in your city because the percentage, like I said, is roughly 2.5, right? The reason for that is our interaction with certain services in the city is fairly limited. The number of times I interact with the police in the city is very low. So that is reflected in what I build, what I want from the city, right? Now, you can come back and ask me the question, isn't that also a reflection of the value systems? That people don't want police in their city? Not necessarily, because remember I said the game is not a standalone tool, right? We use this game as a part of a series of exercises, right? Post this game, we also have a debrief session. And in the debrief session, we just ask them questions. We don't preach. Like I said, no judgment. That's the critical piece in any game, right? And when we ask people what happened, what do you think about the city? The first thing they say is, oh, we should have planned better. Right? And this is everyone across the board. Urban planners, academics, architects, students, just the average resident in a city, all of us. We don't plan on a regular basis. We are not trained to plan, right? And this is also a game where I was telling you intangible data can be collected, right? In the earlier session, we were talking about kids, right? So we play this game with 6-year-olds all the way up to 65-year-olds. Now, when we played it with kids, in the same game, we've just told them, build your own city. That's it. The first thing the kids do is discuss the future that they want. We've had so many runs with kids. Every single run, kids discuss the future that they want in the city and then build. We've had sessions where we've had to tell the kids, if you don't play, we'll walk away. Same rules. We play with adults. There is no conversation. For 1.5 an hour, not one single adult speaks to another adult. The only discussion that they will have is, why did you build this over here? I wanted to build something here, right? So that's the difference in terms of age difference, right? There's also various cultural differences that I can give examples about later on. And in case any of you have anything you'd like to ask, just stop me right away. So the kids, for example, in one game, they actually discussed in 2025. This was played in 2015, so they were planning it for 20 years. They said by 2025, our city should not have any flyovers. Another kid said in 20 years, we should have a playground in every neighborhood. So they have different objectives. Each time the kids come up with very, very interesting insights. Another group of kids actually said that we will not have vehicles in our city. Everything will be walkable, right? So each one of them has their own ways of articulating what is the future that they want. And in some, it was also interesting because some of these kids actually decided they'll form their own roles. So it was a game of, I think, about 40 kids, and about 4 kids in each group decided they'll have their own role. So they carved out their own role. One group was elected the mayor. Another group became responsible for transport. Another group responsible for waste. So they do that on their own as well. So there's a lot more planning involved, a lot more collaboration, I would say, in such games. This is another game that we made. This is a game that we made to talk about what is the concept of caste, class, and gender. So all of them that you see playing the game here are playing the role of garment factory workers. So what is known about Bangalore is the IT industry. What is not known about Bangalore, to many people in this room probably as well, is that the largest or the second largest employer in Bangalore is the garment industry. They employ the same number, if not more, number of people in their factories in Bangalore. And these garment factory workers travel anywhere between, on an average of 15 kilometers sometimes, to get to their workplace. Not very dissimilar to the IT employees. The only dissimilarity being that the IT employees either have their own vehicles or they have access to transport services, and they have flexible working hours, which is not necessarily the case with garment factory workers, right? You don't reach on time, your schedule starts at 8. If you miss that shift by even 10 minutes, you lose your wage. There is no negotiation. You lose your daily wage, right? So this was a game created to understand that the intersection between caste, class, and gender. Because what happens is, on an average, on any garment factory in India, if you go to the garment factories in India, it's mostly women employees. If there are men, they will be employed for very specific roles, such as the floor managers or very specific roles like that. And then what also happens is that, especially in the context of poverty, urban poverty, is when we play this game, one of the insights to give you about this, why is it important to design good games, is in this game, what we do is that they play the role of a garment factory worker and they experience what happens on an everyday basis. And we also leave it open. They get to challenge and question certain things in the game as well. More often than not, they end up going late to work because they missed their bus, because there was an emergency at home, because there was no power, a whole host of reasons, right? More often than not, they ask us, that's fine, even if I go late to work, that's fine. I will negotiate with my floor manager that I was late to work. It's almost inevitable that many of us who have the privilege to be able to say that to another person. But in this context, they don't have that option. So it's a quick, sudden realization for many of them that that's a privilege that we have. It's not something that is a given, that I lose my wage because of that, right? So this is a game that we used essentially to talk about the challenges between class, having that class difference, having caste is another element that we employ in this game as well, and the issues with respect to gender. So all of you know Bangalore as the IT city. Very few of you might know it's also called the garbage city. 2012, the High Court of Bangalore took notice. All of those are protests from people who live next to landfills in Bangalore. The different villages were converted to landfills. So they were not landfills, they were different villages, right? We have a wonderful way of disposing of waste in Indian cities across the whole country. We take our waste, this is the city, we take our waste and we dump it outside. That's what we do. Now, if there are people living next to it, that's perfectly fine. As long as our city is clean, right? It's perfectly fine. So they protested because it's funny how these unintended consequences come up in public policy, right? I was talking about wicked problems, right? Because of waste piles next to the village, because it became so unbearable, because it became so unlivable, the marriage rates in these villages dropped. Because people from other villages didn't want their daughters to go live in this village. So suddenly you had a huge spike in the number of unmarried young men in these villages. So these are these unintended consequences that you see when you have problems in our world, right? What we did was we looked at what the problem was. Yeah, this is a very stylized mapping of that problem. These are the few actors in the waste disposal system. We looked at who the actors were, where was the problem coming from. This phase took us about 3 to 6 months to understand this problem. Because this game, for example, I'll give you a context of why we say no to games, right? I mentioned that in the beginning. People wanted us to create a game to raise awareness. That is a big red flag for me. A game is not the best way to create awareness. It's probably the worst way to create awareness. There are simpler, better, more efficient ways to create awareness. They wanted the game as a tool to create empathy for waste workers. When we did this mapping, we realized that is not the issue. The issue is not that people don't empathize with waste workers. The issue is people don't care about waste in itself. So a game for that context would have been a very, very different game. Whereas in this context, the problem had to deal with the life cycle of waste. Because we don't see waste once it goes outside our house. Beyond our house, beyond our office, beyond our environs, we don't see waste. We don't see what happens to it. So the question was about the full life cycle. So that's why when we did this mapping, so this becomes a critical part of any game design exercise, understanding the problem better. And when we created this, we realized that we need to create a game which shows people the full life cycle of waste. This is the board game that we've created. In the first version of the game, So this is the first version of the game. You can't see potentially what's behind me or if it's not projected over here. So this was the first version of the game. The game worked remarkably well, right? People started thinking about the life. You play the role of a dry waste collection center manager. You need to manage all the waste that comes into your neighborhood, and you need to segregate, you need to sort, and then make a profit. That was the objective in the game, right? Which is the real world model. Dry waste collection centers across India now, wherever they exist. Thankfully, a few cities in India have started already, Pune being one, Bangalore being the other. I don't know if it exists in Hyderabad yet, but DWCCs are mandated across the country now. Every city needs to have dry waste collection. And that's the objective of a dry waste collection center manager. I need to make a profit. I need to sell all this waste, segregate, sort this waste and make a profit. So people did that. But when they realized that they were not able to manage the waste that was being created, they would ask if we can dump it. So they would start dumping the waste. Right? So the objective of the game was not met anymore. Right? Because they're doing the same thing that is happening in the real world. What's the point? Right? So that's when we introduced a landfill. So we introduced a landfill in itself in the game. So this dustbin that you see here is the landfill. So at the end of every round, all the waste that you did not segregate, sort, went into the landfill. Right? And what we did was we said there is collective failure in the game. As soon as this landfill is full, you lose. The whole city loses. Not just you, the whole city loses. Right? Because in the real world, it's the same problem. All of us are suffering because all of us don't segregate and sort, and we end up throwing things into the landfill, which hurts all of us in turn. It's a collective, it's a commons problem, right? So collective failure. And this is an example of how you can model the real world in games without adding points, without adding coins. Because the minute you add an incentive layer, people are very clever. All of us are very clever. What we want to do is win. What we want to do is break the game. I don't care about the objective of the game. I don't care about all of those things. How do I win? Right? So if that is why you should not add the layer of points, the layer of coins or any other such system which does not exist in the real world. It takes away from the real world experience. So as soon as we added this, their behavior changed. Everybody is now worried about this. Right? But not until it rises to the very end. So another common behavior we've noticed in this game, as soon as it starts rising into the top, then people panic. They realize, oh no, now we are going to lose. So what do? They dump out all the waste and then they stack these wooden blocks. They stack them neatly so that they can get 1 or 2 more rounds. So what does that mean? So when we ask them what does that mean in the debrief session, everybody tells us that it was good that we went through that experience because now we know the sense of urgency with which we need to deal with the problem. Right? So then they start talking, now you're not discussing whether you need to segregate or sort. That's a given. Everybody wants to segregate and sort. Nobody wants to not do it anymore. That's not the point of the conversation. Because now they've seen the full life cycle of what happens to the waste. Right? So that's an important distinction again. This is why I said awareness games don't work. Because in awareness games, the objective off and objective in are the same more often than not. Which is probably the worst possible tactic that you can do. And it's injustice to the players and to the method. Because what has happened now is there's a distrust for awareness games that has crept in. So don't have the same objective off and objective in the game. And this is actually a game session that we had with waste workers in our neighborhood. This is a game that we've created on transport, and these are actually planners in BMTC, which is similar to the bus company in Hyderabad. Bangalore Metropolitan Transport Company, that's in Bangalore. So they're planning routes for Bangalore in the game. Why is this game important? This game is important because you're able to collect preferences and needs from different communities. In this game, we were able to collect it from planners within the government agency. In this context, these are with commuter groups who are underrepresented, not people who have access to Twitter, Facebook, who can go complain about services, or not people who have access to newspaper columns who can write op-eds, but commuters who do not have access. So you can collect their preference and bias data that you need to plan transport better and incorporate it, give it back to the planners to be able to use it in their planning process. This is in the context of energy. All of these people sitting in the room that you see are roughly between 10 to 25 years experience in the Indian Administrative Service. They're all IAS officers working in the area of energy. They're coming up with the energy plan for the country. So yes, so this is how they start the game. As you can see, all of them are not so keen about playing a game. It's a game, right? It's for kids. And the suspense was broken. This is how they ended up playing the game, right? So it's also a misnomer that adults don't play games. They will, but there are 3 criteria for that, especially with an audience like this. The first one is realism. So when this game was created, the data that it took us, this is actually the 4th or 5th version of the game that they're playing. And it took us 24 months to get the game right. The reason for that is the data. The data for energy that we have in the country comes from many, many different sources. So we had to triangulate data from that. And the data for coal for a certain type of technology in India is 2.54 rupees per kilowatt hour. That is a generation cost. We actually use the same number in the game. So the first factor is realism, right? I think Ivan also spoke about that, right? When you're creating games for very specific target audience, realism is important. The fidelity of the model becomes very crucial. And in this game, the computer that you see over there is just a sophisticated calculator. That's it. Instead of getting them to do pen and paper calculations, they enter the numbers on a web interface which does the calculation, right? That's it. So that is also one of the other thing, right? Deciding digital versus physical. In the first slide, I dissed digital. I said that's the worst possible medium X, Y, Z, right? Now, when you think about the context is where the medium plays a role. Based on the context, you decide which medium is useful. Whether that's a mixed medium, whether that's AR, whether that's VR, whether that's only a tablet mode, whichever it is, it's the context of use. So based on that, you design the game, right? I'll give you another example of such a game later on, right? Now, one of the third and the most important reason to get these games to be a success is don't burden them. Don't burden the players. If this is work that they have to do outside of their everyday work, they will not like it. They will not like playing this game. They will hate the experience. It has to add value to whatever they're doing then and there. And if you're able to show them that value, then the utility of the game increases drastically. So then they will participate. So if you have a buy-in, right? And the advantage that we have is by virtue of being a non-profit research organization, the advantage that we have is we have a captive audience. Because every project that we work on, we either have a government partner or a civil society partner on the project. We don't function as a regular sort of an ivory tower think tank which produces reports. Because we feel these tools have to be embedded in the organizations that we work with. They are our natural organic partners. So they actually in many contexts design the game for us as well. So they create the game with us. So they have a sense of ownership and they can also tell us where the game will work and where it will not work. So that becomes an important element, right? That's the last one. Now I'll move on to disaster management. So this is essentially a game to test disaster management protocols. So until 2005, when we had the tsunami in India, for people who are not familiar with the disaster management context, we did not have a disaster management protocol in this country. We did not have a disaster management authority in this country. 2005 tsunami is what thankfully or for whatever reason gave us a disaster management authority, right? Before that, there were few states that were very good in disaster management. Orissa, for example, because of the constant hurricanes and cyclones and floods that they face, they have a wonderfully smoothly working disaster management process. That's not true for the rest of the country. NDMA was only created in 2005 and then we mandated that, by we I mean the country at large, not me or my organization, that we should have a protocol for disaster management. More often than not, when people decide that they need a protocol for something, what do? Copy paste. Take a protocol from somewhere else and use the protocol here. And more often than not, what does that mean? It will not work. It will fail miserably, right? So that's what happened with the protocol that was used as well. So this is a game that we created to test any new protocols or design new protocols. And the thing is, when designing, so this is where I said context is important, right? Disaster management works on very simple rules. How prepared are you? How quickly can you respond? How quickly can you resolve a certain situation? I mean, I'm boiling it down to 3 simple rules. It's a lot more complicated than that. But it's these 3 principles that work. Yeah, sure. So what that really means is that people need to be able to design these protocols well, right? But the problem is you have very limited time. you have, all of us are technophiles at heart. We think that when it comes to disaster management, as soon as we have more technology in place, we will address the situation better. No, it is actually communication standards, communication protocols that help better, irrespective of whether we are using technology or not. So this is a pen and paper game, and all the people sitting in the room are people who have been in the disaster management area for about 10 to 20 years. So on the left hand side, you have people in the civilian section. On the right hand side, you have people who are actually from the military liaison section. We played the same game with them. We did not give both of them a protocol. As soon as disaster struck, so you see a big clock there as well as in the background, right? You see a big clock. That's a live counter that we did. So that is the only digital piece that we used in the game. The thumb rule that's used in disaster management is if the first responder is not there at the scene before 15 minutes, then it means that you have not addressed the situation effectively. So we use that counter there. People on the, that is from the civilian force, did not have a protocol. On the military side as well, they didn't have a protocol. But what happened? So as soon as they got information that the disaster is hit, the people trained under military rules immediately established a protocol, even when there was none. And they were able to address, so all information flowed through one person, that person validated it, then sent it through a hierarchical system to other people, right? Very ordered, very logical flow of information. And they were able to address this situation in 7 minutes. Now this set of people did not have any protocol, did not have prior training, but they managed to effectively evolve a protocol and address the situation in 10 minutes. So you might say 3 minutes was the difference when there was no protocol. How big of a deal is it? It is a big deal when it comes to disaster management, right? But what you were able to test is what does a protocol do and what does a protocol not do. Now when we gave them a protocol, they were able to even weed out spurious information. We actually fed false information of the disaster being somewhere else or the ambulances being stuck somewhere else. But because they had a protocol, they were able to weed it out, right? So that is where a game like this helps. So this is actually a visualization of that information. A lot of data was collected with this information. This is just an example of one kind of use of that data. Which actor is overburdened, which actor has the right amount of information, which actor has the least amount of information. The next game is a digital game. This is what I was telling you. I'll give you another example. So this is a game that we worked with the UN on. This is actually a learning game. Where players play the role of this overarching decision maker in their countries. And what they do is they take policy decisions for their countries between the year 1990 and 2010. So on an average, a player has about 240 parameters that they have to look at. That's a lot of information, right? So a physical game is pretty pointless at this point in time. This is when a digital game is useful because you can layer in information, you can layer in complexity. This is much harder to do in a physical game. But this game is not played in a one sitting session. This game is a classroom game, which means you play it over a course of a semester for 6 months. That's the amount of time that you take to play this game because the subject matter is also very dense, very complicated. This is actually a picture of economists, if you can believe it or not. Even they have never seen themselves having so much fun in the class. I'll give you another example of disaster game. This is actually a screenshot, a small screenshot. I cannot show you the details for obvious reasons because this is an airport in India. This is the actual flight plans in the airport. We created this a good decade ago. This was, I think, just before even Unreal and Cry were available for non-commercial users. They actually gave it to us for this game for non-commercial use. We created this for disaster management training in the airport. And, here, what was key and critical? Yeah, what was key and critical was to be able to mimic what happens in the real world. That is, every single step that they follow in the real world had to be mimicked here, without which the game was futile. So there are a lot of other examples. You can look at it in our website. These are a few of our partners. I'm going to wrap up very, very quickly. I'm not going through all the details, but yes. This is what I was talking about in terms of where games can be used to get quantitative and qualitative information. There are lots of definitions of games that you can use. You can look up all of this on our website as well. And I shall end with this. Thank you.